The old cemetery sat on the edge of town, forgotten by most folks except during the annual Memorial Day service. Tall oak trees cast long shadows across weathered tombstones, their roots slowly claiming the grounds in a patient, inevitable embrace. For years, Daniel walked past it on his way to work, glancing through the rusted iron gates with passing curiosity. He'd never given much thought to what lay beyond them until the flyer appeared on the community board at his local coffee shop. Volunteers needed, it read in bold letters. Help restore Pine Creek Historic Cemetery. Preserve our town's heritage. Daniel wasn't sure why he tore off one of the little paper tabs with contact information. He wasn't particularly handy, nor did he have any special connection to the cemetery. Perhaps it was the mundane routine of his life lately, wake up, work at the small accounting firm, come home, repeat, that made any change of pace appealing. Or maybe it was the recent passing of his grandfather, whose stories about the town's history had always fascinated him as a child. Whatever the reason, the following Saturday found Daniel pulling into the gravel parking lot beside the cemetery, dressed in work clothes and carrying gardening gloves he'd bought specifically for this occasion. "You must be Daniel," a gray-haired woman called out, waving from a folding table set up near the entrance. Her name was Betsy, head of the local historical society and organizer of the restoration project. "Perfect timing. We're just getting everyone assigned to their areas." About a dozen other volunteers had gathered, a mix of retirees, high school students earning community service hours, and a few people around Daniel's age. Betsy handed out maps of the cemetery with sections marked off in colored pencil. "We're focusing on the oldest sections first," she explained, pointing to the far corner of the cemetery. "Some of these graves haven't been properly tended to in decades. We have family permission where possible, but many have no living relatives left to care for them." Daniel looked down at his map. He'd been assigned to Section F, one of the oldest parts dating back to the early 1900s. "There's a family plot there. The Harringtons," Betsy told him. "Important family back in their day. They owned the lumber mill that built half the town." Daniel nodded, strangely drawn to the assignment. He gathered supplies, pruning shears, a brush, environmentally safe cleaning solution, and a bucket, and made his way through the cemetery. As he walked, he read the names and dates on the headstones he passed. So many stories, he thought. So many lives reduced to names carved in stone. Section F was overgrown with weeds and volunteer saplings. Wild roses had claimed one corner, their thorny stems weaving through a wrought iron fence that once protected a family plot. It took Daniel nearly 20 minutes just to find the Harrington grave among the tall grass. The family monument stood about 5 feet tall, once impressive, now leaning slightly to one side as the ground beneath it slowly shifted. Smaller headstones surrounded it, marking individual family members. Daniel set down his supplies and pulled out his phone to take a before picture, as Betsy had suggested. The main monument read, "Harrington," in large weathered letters. Below were inscribed the words, "As we are now, so you shall be." Daniel shivered slightly despite the warm spring air. He started by pulling weeds and clearing brush around the plot. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. There was something satisfying about the work. Immediate results as patches of overgrowth gave way to reveal the original landscaping stones and borders. By midday, he had cleared the entire plot and could properly see all the headstones. The family patriarch, Thomas Harrington, had died in 1952 at the age of 76. His wife, Elizabeth, had preceded him in death, passing in 1925 when she was only 28 years old. Daniel paused, doing the math in his head. She'd been young, too young. He found himself wondering what had happened to her. After a quick lunch break with the other volunteers, Daniel returned to tackle the cleaning of the stones themselves. Decades of pollution, moss, and bird droppings had left them discolored and difficult to read. Following the instructions from the morning briefing, he mixed the gentle cleaner with water and began carefully scrubbing the main monument with a soft brush. The work was meditative. As layer after layer of grime washed away, Daniel felt strangely connected to these people he'd never known. He moved on to Elizabeth's headstone, working carefully around the delicate carving of roses that framed her name. "Elizabeth Rose Harrington," he read aloud as the inscription became clearer. "Beloved wife and daughter, gone too soon but never forgotten." As Daniel scrubbed near the base of her headstone, his brush caught on something. At first he thought it was just an uneven part of the stone, But as he cleared more dirt away, he realized there was something embedded in the granite, something that didn't belong. Curious, he set down his brush and retrieved a smaller tool from his bucket, carefully working around what appeared to be a small metal object. It took several minutes of gentle probing before it came loose, falling into his palm with a slight weight that surprised him. Daniel wiped away the dirt to reveal a tarnished locket about the size of a quarter. Its surface was ornate, with a pattern of vines and flowers etched into the metal. It looked old, possibly as old as the grave itself. He glanced around, suddenly feeling like he'd done something wrong by removing it, though it clearly wasn't part of the original headstone. Should he tell Betsy? Put it back? His curiosity won out as he carefully tried to open the locket. It was stuck at first, the hinge stiff with age and corrosion. Just as the locket finally gave way with a soft click, a voice called out behind him. "How's it going over here?" Daniel startled, nearly dropping the locket as he turned to see Betsy making her rounds among the volunteers. He quickly slipped the locket into his pocket, a reflexive action he immediately regretted. "Making good progress," he said, gesturing to the cleared plot. "Almost finished with the cleaning." Betsy nodded approvingly. "The Harrington plot looks wonderful. You have a knack for this kind of work." As they chatted about the history of the family, Daniel's mind kept returning to the weight of the locket in his pocket. Why had he hidden it? He should just show it to Betsy. She'd know what to do with it. But something held him back. Maybe it was the strange placement of the locket, seemingly pressed into the stone rather than left as an offering. Or perhaps it was the unusual feeling that had come over him since he'd arrived at this particular grave. A feeling that there was more to Elizabeth Harrington's story than what was carved on her headstone. "You know, she died young," Betsy remarked as if reading his thoughts. "There were rumors back then, though my grandmother would never speak of them directly. Just said it was a terrible business whenever the subject came up." Daniel's curiosity deepened. "What kind of rumors?" Betsy shrugged. "That's just it, no one would say. Small-town secrets." She glanced at her watch. "Well, I should check on the others. We'll be wrapping up around 4 today." After she left, Daniel returned to his cleaning, but his mind wasn't on the task anymore. Every few minutes, his hand would drift to his pocket, feeling the outline of the locket. When 4 o'clock finally came, he packed up his supplies and returned them to the supply table, exchanging pleasantries with the other volunteers. Several people commented on how much better the Harrington plot looked. Daniel should have felt proud of his work, but as he drove home, all he could think about was the locket. Once inside his apartment, he immediately took it out and examined it more carefully under his desk lamp. The tarnish was heavy, but he could make out fine craftsmanship beneath. With the proper leverage, the locket fully opened to reveal 2 compartments. In one was a faded photograph of a young woman. Not a formal portrait, but a candid shot, her face caught mid-laugh. She wore the style of the early 1920s. Her dark hair bobbed beneath a cloche hat. She was beautiful in a lively, vibrant way that seemed to reach across the decades. But it was the second compartment that truly caught Daniel's attention. Nestled inside was a small brass key, tarnished like the locket itself but still intact. Daniel stared at these items, a strange feeling washing over him. This wasn't Elizabeth Harrington. He somehow knew that instinctively. The woman in the photograph was someone else entirely. And why would a key be hidden alongside her picture in a locket embedded in Elizabeth's grave? He turned the key over in his fingers, wondering what lock it might open. The only marking was a tiny B&S stamped on its head, possibly a manufacturer. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the face of the woman from the locket, imagining her laugh, wondering who she had been and what connection she had to the Harringtons. By morning, he had made up his mind. He would go to the town library and see if he could find any information about the family. Newspaper archives, public records, anything that might shed light on Elizabeth's early death and the mysterious woman in the locket. What had started as a simple community service project had become something more, a mystery reaching out from nearly 100 years in the past. Daniel didn't yet understand why, but he felt compelled to uncover the truth. Someone had gone to great lengths to place that locket in Elizabeth Harrington's grave, and as the first person to find it in what must have been decades, he couldn't simply ignore it. Whatever secrets lay buried in Pine Creek Cemetery, Daniel was now determined to bring them into the light. The Pine Creek Public Library was housed in a brick building from the 1930s, with tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. Daniel arrived just after it opened on Monday morning, having called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. The locket sat heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the questions that had kept him awake all weekend. Mrs. Winters, the head librarian, looked up from her computer as Daniel approached the front desk. Her silver-rimmed glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and she peered at him over reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "Well, if it isn't Jack's grandson," she said with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you in here since high school. What can I help you with today?" Daniel had forgotten that his grandfather and Mrs. Winters had been friends. In a small town like Pine Creek, everyone seemed connected somehow. "I'm looking for information about the Harrington family," Daniel explained. "I was cleaning their family plot at the cemetery this weekend, and I got curious about their history." Mrs. Winters' eyebrows rose slightly. "The Harringtons? Now there's a name from the past. We have some materials in our local history section, and microfilm of the old town newspapers. Follow me." She led him to a small room at the back of the library where filing cabinets lined the walls and a microfilm reader sat on a sturdy oak table. The Harringtons were quite prominent back in the day, Mrs. Winters explained as she pulled open a drawer labeled HK and rifled through the folders. Thomas Harrington ran the lumber mill and his father before him. They essentially built this town in the early 1900s. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Harrington Family and placed it on the table. "Start with this. The newspaper archives from 1920 to 1930 would be your best bet for more information. I'll show you how to use the microfilm reader." Daniel thanked her and settled in for what he expected would be hours of research. The folder contained various documents, property records, photographs of the lumber mill, newspaper clippings about business dealings, and a family tree that someone had carefully constructed. He found Elizabeth quickly enough. Born Elizabeth Rose Montgomery in 1897, married Thomas Harrington in 1919, died 1925. No children listed. The brief notation gave no hint of the story behind her early death. Thomas Harrington had remarried in 1927 to a woman named Helen Blackwood. They had 3 children together before Thomas died in 1952. Nothing in the folder mentioned anyone who might be the woman in the locket. Daniel pulled out his phone and took a photo of the family tree, then turned to the microfilm archives. The old newspapers were fascinating glimpses into Pine Creek's past. Daniel started with 1925, the year of Elizabeth's death, and began scrolling through the weekly editions of the Pine Creek Gazette. He found her obituary in the March 13th issue. Elizabeth, Rose Harrington, beloved wife of Thomas Harrington, passed away on March 9, 1925, after a brief illness. Mrs. Harrington, 28, was known for her charitable work with the Ladies' Aid Society and her beautiful singing voice, which graced many church services. Funeral services will be held at First Methodist Church on Saturday, March 14th. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Ladies' Aid Society. Brief illness. That was curiously vague. Daniel continued scanning through the papers, working backward through 1924 and 1923, looking for any mention of Elizabeth or the Harringtons that might give him more information. In a social column from July 1924, he found a brief mention. Mr. Thomas Harrington has returned from a business trip to Boston. Mrs. Harrington remains at home recovering from a period of ill health. The household is being managed in her absence by Miss Marie Fontaine, recently arrived from Montreal. Daniel sat up straighter. Marie Fontaine. Could she be the woman in the locket? He quickly took notes and continued searching. The next mention of Marie came in August 1924. The annual summer festival was a grand success. Of particular note was the pie contest, won by Miss Marie Fontaine, whose French apple tart was declared revolutionary by Judge Peterson. By November, Marie had become a regular feature in the town's social pages. She had joined the church choir, volunteered at the library, and seemed well liked by the community. But the last mention of her was in a small article dated December 18, 1924. Miss Marie Fontaine, who has been employed in the Harrington household for the past 6 months, has returned to Canada due to a family emergency. Her presence at the Christmas pageant will be sorely missed as she was to perform a solo. After that, Marie disappeared from the record. Daniel went back to scanning for information about Elizabeth, finding scattered mentions of her continued ill health throughout late 1924 and early 1925, until her death in March. With growing curiosity, Daniel returned to the front desk where Mrs. Winters was sorting through returned books. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Sort of," Daniel replied. "I'm trying to find more information about someone named Marie Fontaine. She worked for the Harringtons in 1924. Mrs. Winters paused, a book halfway to the cart beside her. "Fontaine? That does sound familiar." She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "You know who might remember. My Aunt Lucy. She's 96 now, but her mind is sharp as ever. She grew up in Pine Creek and remembers all sorts of things the rest of us have forgotten." Daniel couldn't believe his luck. "Do you think she'd be willing to talk to me?" "She loves visitors," Mrs. Winters said, smiling. "I'm heading over to bring her lunch at noon. You're welcome to join me." 2 hours later, Daniel found himself sitting in a tidy living room filled with crocheted blankets and family photographs. Lucy Parker sat in a recliner by the window, her thin white hair arranged neatly around a face mapped with wrinkles. "So you want to know about the Harringtons?" she asked after Mrs. Winters had explained Daniel's project. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. I'm particularly interested in Elizabeth Harrington and a woman who worked for them, Marie Fontaine," Daniel explained. Lucy's eyes sharpened with recognition. "Marie Fontaine. Yes, I remember her. Pretty girl with dark hair, French-Canadian, lovely singing voice." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window. "There was talk about her, you know, when she left so suddenly." Daniel leaned forward. "What kind of talk?" "Well, some said she and Thomas Harrington were friendly." Lucy chose her words carefully. Elizabeth had been sick for months by then, some kind of wasting illness that kept her bedridden. Marie was running the household. Things happen. "And then Marie just left?" Daniel prompted. Lucy nodded slowly. "That's the official story. Family emergency back in Canada. But nobody ever heard from her again. Not even Pauline at the bakery, and they were thick as thieves." "Do you think something happened to her?" Daniel asked. Lucy shrugged her thin shoulders. "It was all a long time ago, but I'll tell you this. Elizabeth started getting sick not long after Marie came to work for them. At first, people thought it was just her delicate constitution. But later, later there were whispers." "What kind of whispers?" "That maybe her illness wasn't natural. That maybe someone was helping it along." Lucy's voice had dropped to a near whisper. "Nothing was ever proven, of course. The doctor signed off on heart failure. But Elizabeth's mother, she never accepted that. Kept saying her daughter was poisoned." Daniel felt a chill run through him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, now cleaned of its tarnish. "Mrs. Parker, do you recognize this woman?" Lucy put on her glasses and examined the photograph inside the locket. Her eyes widened slightly. "Where did you get this?" "It was embedded in Elizabeth Harrington's headstone," Daniel said, "along with this key." Lucy handed back the locket with shaking hands. "That's her. That's Marie Fontaine." The room fell silent as Daniel processed this information. So someone put Marie's locket in Elizabeth's grave. Why would they do that? "I don't know," Lucy said, "but if what Elizabeth's mother believed was true." She didn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Winters, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "The county medical examiner's office might have records from that time. They keep everything." Daniel nodded, his mind racing. "Thank you both. This has been incredibly helpful." As they were leaving, Lucy called out to him, "Young man, be careful digging into old graves. Sometimes what's buried should stay that way." The next day found Daniel at the county records office, requesting Elizabeth Harrington's death certificate and any related medical records. The clerk seemed surprised by the request, but didn't ask questions. While waiting, Daniel examined the key from the locket more carefully. The B&S marking had been bothering him. On a hunch, he searched for B&S Lockbox 1920s on his phone. The results confirmed his suspicion. Bradshaw and Sons had been a prominent manufacturer of lockboxes and safes in the early 20th century. Their products were known for their security and were commonly used for storing important documents and valuables. "Mr. Reynolds?" The clerk's voice interrupted his thoughts. "I've found the records you requested." Daniel approached the counter, where the clerk handed him a folder. "That's strange," the clerk commented. "There are 2 death certificates here." Daniel opened the folder. The first document was as expected: Elizabeth Harrington's official death certificate, listing heart failure as the cause of death, signed by Dr. James Wilson on March 10, 1925. But beneath it was a second unofficial document, medical notes from Dr. Wilson dated March 8, 1925, just 1 day before Elizabeth died. At the bottom, underlined twice, were the words, "Symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. Further investigation warranted." That investigation had apparently never happened. Elizabeth had been buried with heart failure listed as her official cause of death, and the doctor's suspicions had been filed away and forgotten, until now. Daniel stared at the documents, the implications sinking in. If Elizabeth had been poisoned and Marie had disappeared around the same time, the locket felt even heavier in his pocket now. Someone had placed Marie's locket and key in Elizabeth's grave, perhaps as a silent accusation, a clue that had waited almost 100 years to be found, and Daniel had found it. Now he needed to know what the key opened, and whether it would lead him to the truth about what had really happened to both women. As he walked back to his car, Daniel couldn't shake Lucy's warning from his mind. Maybe some things should stay buried, but he had come too far to turn back now. Whatever secrets the Harrington family had kept, he was determined to uncover them, for Marie, for Elizabeth, and for the truth that had been hidden for far too long. Rain pattered against the windshield as Daniel sat in his parked car outside the county records office, staring at the medical notes in his hands. The words blurred together as his mind raced with possibilities. Arsenic poisoning. Not a natural death at all, but murder. And what had happened to Marie Fontaine? Had she really returned to Canada, or had something more sinister occurred? The rain grew heavier, drumming on the roof of his car like impatient fingers. Daniel carefully placed the documents in a folder and started the engine. He needed to find out what the key opened, and there was only one place to start looking. The Harrington house still stood on Maple Street, though it had changed hands many times since Thomas Harrington's death in 1952. According to property records Daniel had found, it was now owned by an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who had lived there for nearly 30 years. It took all of Daniel's courage to knock on their door that afternoon. What would he say? "Excuse me, I found a key hidden in a grave and I think it might open something in your house." It sounded crazy even to him, but as he stood on the wide front porch of the Victorian-style home, rainwater dripping from his jacket, Daniel reminded himself of what was at stake. 2 women had possibly died under suspicious circumstances. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth, he had to try. A white-haired man opened the door, eyeing Daniel curiously through wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice friendly but cautious. "My name is Daniel Reynolds," he began, trying to sound as normal as possible. "I'm helping with the restoration project at Pine Creek Cemetery, and I've been researching the history of the Harrington family." The man's expression softened. "Oh yes, I heard about the restoration. Good work you folks are doing. I'm Robert Henderson. My wife and I have owned this place since '95. It's a beautiful home," Daniel said sincerely. "I was wondering if you might know anything about the family who built it. Or if you've ever found anything unusual during renovations." Robert chuckled. "Well, we found plenty of unusual things. Old houses are full of surprises. Why don't you come in out of the rain? Judy just made some coffee." Relief washed over Daniel as he stepped into the warm, inviting home. The interior had been modernized, but the original woodwork remained. Dark, polished oak that spoke of the lumber fortune that had built it. Robert led him to a sunny kitchen where Judy Henderson was arranging cookies on a plate. She welcomed Daniel with the same warmth as her husband, and soon they were seated at the kitchen table, sharing stories about the old house. "We've found all sorts of things in the walls and under floorboards during renovations," Robert explained. "Old newspapers, toys, even a pair of shoes that the builders supposedly left for good luck. The most interesting things were in the attic," Judy added. "Trunks full of clothes, old photographs, letters. The family who sold us the house didn't want any of it." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Do you still have those items?" "Some of them," Robert said. "We donated a lot to the Historical Society, but we kept a few pieces that caught our interest. There's an old desk upstairs that we couldn't bear to part with. Beautiful craftsmanship. Would it be possible to see it?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The Hendersons exchanged glances, then Judy nodded. "I don't see why not. It's in the guest room now." As they climbed the stairs, Daniel felt the weight of the key in his pocket. The chances that it would fit anything in this house after all these years were slim, but he had to try. The guest room was small but charming, with a large window overlooking the backyard. Against one wall stood a roll-top desk made of the same dark oak as the rest of the woodwork in the house. "This desk came with the house," Robert explained. "We believe it belonged to Thomas Harrington himself. Look at the detail on the carvings." Daniel ran his fingers over the intricate patterns on the desk's surface. Flowers and vines similar to the pattern on the locket. His heart began to pound. "The interesting thing," Judy continued, "is that there's a hidden compartment we only discovered a few years ago." Robert was fixing a stuck drawer and he found it. She reached under the desktop and pressed something. A small panel on the side of the desk popped open, revealing a narrow space just large enough to hold a thin box. "There's nothing in there now," Robert said, "but we found an old photograph tucked inside when we first discovered it. I think we still have it somewhere." While Robert went to look for the photograph, Daniel examined the hidden compartment more closely. It was lined with faded velvet, and at the back was a small brass keyhole. Without thinking, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the key from the locket. It was the same brass color tarnished with age. "What's that?" Judy asked, watching him curiously. Daniel hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I found this key in Elizabeth Harrington's grave. It was hidden inside a locket that had been embedded in her headstone." Instead of looking shocked or suspicious, Judy's eyes widened with interest. "How extraordinary. Do you think it fits?" "I'd like to try," Daniel admitted. She nodded encouragingly, and Daniel carefully inserted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. He turned it and heard a soft click. The velvet lining of the compartment shifted, revealing yet another hidden space beneath. Inside lay a small leather-bound book. "It's a diary," Judy breathed, peering over his shoulder. Daniel carefully lifted the book out of its hiding place. The leather was cracked with age, but still intact. On the inside cover, written in flowing script, was a name, Marie Fontaine. Robert returned with an old photograph in a cardboard frame. "Found it," he announced, then stopped when he saw what they were looking at. "What's that?" "I think," Daniel said slowly, "it's the diary of a woman who disappeared in 1924. The three of them moved to the living room, where Daniel explained everything he had discovered so far: the locket, Marie's disappearance, and Elizabeth's suspicious death. The Hendersons listened without interruption, their expressions growing more serious with each revelation. "We knew this house had history," Robert said when Daniel finished, "but nothing like this." "May I?" Daniel asked, gesturing to the diary. With their permission, he carefully opened it, handling the fragile pages with reverence. The diary began in April 1924, when Marie first arrived in Pine Creek to work for the Harringtons. Her early entries described her delight with the town, her duties in the household, and her impression of her employers. "Mrs. Harrington is kind, but frail," one entry read. "She tires easily and spends much of her time resting. Mr. Harrington is rarely home, busy with the lumber mill and his many business ventures." As Daniel continued reading, a pattern emerged. Elizabeth's health had been deteriorating for months before Marie arrived. But instead of improving with rest and the doctor's treatments, she seemed to grow weaker whenever her husband was home. By July, Marie's entries had become more concerned. "Mrs. H was much improved last week when Mr. H was away on business. Upon his return, she took ill again after dinner. I cannot help but notice this pattern. When I mentioned it to Dr. Wilson, he seemed troubled but said nothing. In August, the tone of the diary changed dramatically. I have seen something I cannot unsee. Last night, while serving tea, I observed Mr. H adding a white powder to his wife's cup when he thought no one was looking. I said nothing, but after they retired, I examined the tea service and found traces of the powder. I have taken a sample. The next entry was dated 2 days later. Dr. Wilson confirmed my fears. The powder is arsenic, commonly used in small doses as a tonic but deadly in larger amounts over time. He believes Mrs. H has been slowly poisoned for months. We are afraid to go to the authorities. Mr. H is the most powerful man in town. The doctor has advised me to gather more evidence while he works to save Mrs. H. Daniel looked up from the diary, meeting the shocked expressions of the Hendersons. Thomas Harrington was poisoning his wife, he said, the reality of it sinking in. And Marie knew. The diary continued through September and October, detailing Marie's efforts to protect Elizabeth by switching teacups and monitoring her food. Elizabeth began to improve slightly, though she remained weak. In November, Marie wrote of her growing friendship with Elizabeth, who had begun to suspect the truth herself. Together, they had started gathering evidence against Thomas, keeping samples of the tainted tea, documenting Elizabeth's symptoms, and collecting financial records that showed Thomas had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife earlier that year. The final entry was dated December 15, 1924. E and I have decided we must leave. The evidence is secured in this diary and in the lockbox. Dr. Wilson has agreed to help us escape to Canada next week, where my family can protect us until we can bring T to justice. E is still weak, but determined. I pray we are not too late. But they had been too late. According to the records Daniel had found, Elizabeth died of heart failure in March 1925, 3 months after Marie's supposed return to Canada, and Marie herself had vanished completely. There are no more entries, Daniel said, carefully closing the diary. But we know Elizabeth never made it to Canada. She died here, officially of heart failure, but the doctor suspected arsenic poisoning. And Marie? Judy asked softly. Daniel shook his head. No one knows what happened to her. She disappeared in December 1924, supposedly to return to Canada due to a family emergency. But after seeing this, he held up the diary. I don't think she ever made it home. Robert leaned forward, his expression grave. You think Thomas Harrington killed them both? It wasn't a question, but Daniel nodded anyway. The diary would have been enough evidence to ruin him, maybe even send him to prison. He couldn't let that happen. But why would someone put Marie's locket in Elizabeth's grave? Judy wondered. Daniel thought about it. Maybe someone knew the truth. The doctor, Dr. Wilson, he knew what was happening. Maybe he put it there as a clue, hoping someday someone would find it and uncover the truth. What will you do now? Robert asked. Daniel looked down at the diary in his hands, feeling the weight of responsibility. 2 women had died nearly a century ago, their stories buried along with them. Until now, I need to take this to the Historical Society, he said, and the police. It may be too late for justice in the legal sense, but their story deserves to be told. As Daniel prepared to leave, Robert handed him the photograph they had found in the desk years ago. I think you should have this, he said. Daniel looked down at the faded image. It showed 2 women sitting on the porch of the very house he was in now. One was frail and pale but smiling. The other was the woman from the locket, Marie Fontaine, her arm protectively around the shoulders of her friend. On the back, written in the same flowing script as the diary, were the words, Elizabeth and Marie, October 1924, friends in life, and perhaps beyond. Daniel carefully tucked the photograph into the diary. As he walked back to his car, the rain having finally stopped, he felt as though Elizabeth and Marie were walking with him, guiding him toward a truth that had waited 100 years to be revealed. The Historical Society's monthly meeting was already underway when Daniel slipped into the back of the room. About 20 people sat in folding chairs, listening to Betsy discuss upcoming events and fundraising efforts for the cemetery restoration project. Daniel clutched his folder of evidence, the diary, the death certificates, the photograph, and the locket, as he waited for his turn to speak. When Betsy finally called on him, Daniel felt every eye in the room turn his way. His throat suddenly dry, he made his way to the front of the small meeting room. As some of you know, he began, I've been researching the Harrington family after cleaning their plot at the cemetery. He took a deep breath. What I found may change how we understand our town's history. For the next 15 minutes, Daniel laid out everything he had discovered, from finding the locket to uncovering Marie's diary. He passed around the photograph of Elizabeth and Marie, watching as it moved from hand to hand, creating ripples of whispered conversations. Based on all this evidence, he concluded, I believe Thomas Harrington murdered his wife Elizabeth through arsenic poisoning, and I think he may have also been responsible for Marie Fontaine's disappearance when she discovered what he was doing. A heavy silence fell over the room. These weren't just historical figures anymore. They were real people whose tragic story had been buried for generations. Finally, an older man at the back stood up. Daniel recognized him as Judge Patterson, retired from the county court. This is quite a story, young man, the judge said. But what exactly are you proposing we do about crimes committed almost 100 years ago? Thomas Harrington has been dead for over 70 years. I don't expect legal justice, Daniel replied, but I think we owe it to Elizabeth and Marie to uncover the truth. Their stories deserve to be told. And what about Marie? Asked another member. If what you're saying is true, what happened to her? Daniel hesitated. I don't know, but I intend to find out. After the meeting, Betsy approached Daniel with a determined look on her face. The Society's board has discussed your findings, she said. We want to fund a proper investigation. If Marie Fontaine never made it back to Canada, she didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what it meant. We'll need to get permission to examine Elizabeth's grave, Betsy continued. If your theory is correct, there might be evidence there that modern forensic techniques could detect. You think they'll allow that? Daniel asked, surprised by how quickly things were moving. Judge Patterson has already offered to help with the legal aspects. And Dr. Reeves, she was at the back of the room, is a forensic anthropologist at the State University. She's offered her services pro bono. Daniel felt a wave of relief. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Over the next week, things happened with surprising speed. Judge Patterson secured the necessary permits to examine Elizabeth Harrington's grave. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the mystery, featuring the photograph of Elizabeth and Marie. People from around town came forward with bits of family lore about the Harringtons, stories passed down through generations that had never before been connected. An elderly man whose grandfather had worked at the lumber mill remembered stories about Thomas Harrington's fierce temper. A woman whose grandmother had been friends with Elizabeth's mother shared a letter in which the mother expressed suspicion about her daughter's declining health. Each piece added to the growing picture of what had happened in 1924 and 1925. Most surprising was the call from a police detective in Montreal. After reading about the case online, he had searched their cold case files and found a missing persons report for Marie Fontaine, filed by her brother in January 1925. According to the report, Marie had written to her family in November 1924, saying she would be returning home soon with a friend who needed help, but she never arrived, and her family never heard from her again. The day of the grave examination arrived cold and clear. A small group gathered at the cemetery. Daniel, Betsy, Judge Patterson, Dr. Reeves and her team from the university, and a few members of the Historical Society. Yellow police tape cordoned off the Harrington plot, giving the proceedings an official air. We'll be as respectful as possible, Dr. Reeves assured them, as her team set up their equipment. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Our ground-penetrating radar will let us see if there's anything unusual before we disturb the actual grave. Daniel watched nervously as they ran the radar equipment over Elizabeth's grave. The technician monitoring the screen suddenly paused, adjusting some settings before looking up with a puzzled expression. Dr. Reeves, you should see this. The anthropologist moved to the screen, studying it intently. That's interesting, she murmured. There appears to be something beneath the primary burial, something approximately the same size as a coffin. A hush fell over the group. Daniel felt his heart racing. You mean there's a second coffin? Betsy asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Dr. Reeves nodded slowly. It certainly appears that way. We'll need to proceed with the excavation to confirm. The actual exhumation took hours. Daniel alternated between watching and pacing, his mind racing with possibilities. By late afternoon, the team had carefully removed Elizabeth's coffin, and placed it respectfully under a canopy for examination. "The coffin is in remarkably good condition," Dr. Reeves noted as she supervised the opening. The embalming techniques of the 1920s were quite advanced. Inside, they found Elizabeth's remains largely skeletonized but well preserved. Dr. Reeves worked methodically, examining and documenting everything. "We'll take samples for toxicology testing," she explained. "Modern techniques can detect arsenic poisoning even after all this time, especially in hair and nail samples if any remain." But everyone's attention was on the continuing excavation below. The team had indeed found a second burial, a plain wooden box with no markings, no nameplate, nothing to identify who might be inside. When they finally opened this second coffin as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Inside lay another set of remains, also female based on Dr. Reeves's preliminary examination. Around the neck of the skeleton was a thin silver chain, the match to the locket Daniel had found. "Marie Fontaine," he whispered, feeling a strange mix of sadness and vindication. Dr. Reeves noted something else, marks on some of the bones that suggested violence. "There appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull," she said quietly. "This woman didn't die of natural causes." In the days that followed, laboratory tests confirmed what Marie's diary had claimed. Elizabeth Harrington's remains showed high levels of arsenic, consistent with long-term poisoning. The second body was harder to identify conclusively, but dental records from Marie's missing persons file in Montreal eventually provided confirmation. Marie Fontaine had never returned to Canada. She had been buried, unnamed and unmourned, beneath her friend Elizabeth. The question that haunted Daniel was who had put her there, and why. The answer came from an unexpected source. After the newspaper published a follow-up story about the discovery of Marie's remains, a lawyer from a firm in the next county contacted the Historical Society. His firm had maintained the Harrington family records for generations, and among them was a sealed letter from Dr. James Wilson, dated 1952, the year Thomas Harrington died. Daniel, Betsy, and Judge Patterson gathered in the lawyer's office as he opened the yellowed envelope and read the letter aloud. "To whom it may concern, with Thomas Harrington now deceased, I can finally reveal what I have carried in silence for too long. In December 1924, Marie Fontaine came to me with evidence that Thomas was slowly poisoning his wife Elizabeth. We made plans to help Elizabeth escape, but Thomas discovered our intentions. On the night of December 16, 1924, Thomas confronted Marie at the house. I arrived too late. Marie was already dead, struck down in Thomas's rage. Elizabeth, weak but determined, witnessed everything from the top of the stairs. Thomas saw her and in his madness confessed to poisoning her as she fled back to her room. I helped Thomas bury Marie in the woods that night, God forgive me. I feared for my own life and for my family. Thomas threatened to destroy us all if I spoke a word of what had happened. Elizabeth's health deteriorated rapidly after that night. Whether from the accumulated poison in her system or from the shock of what she had witnessed, I cannot say. Before she died in March 1925, she made me promise to someday make things right. When we buried Elizabeth, I convinced Thomas to allow a brief private moment for me to pay my respects. In that moment, I placed Marie's locket, which Elizabeth had kept hidden, into the grave. I couldn't bear to see Marie left in an unmarked grave in the woods, so that night, I returned with 2 trusted men. We recovered her body and buried her beneath Elizabeth, 2 friends united in death as they had been in life. Thomas never knew, and I have carried this secret for 27 years. If you are reading this, I am likely gone as well. May Elizabeth and Marie finally find the justice and peace they deserve. Dr. James Wilson. The room fell silent when the lawyer finished reading. Daniel thought about Dr. Wilson, carrying that terrible knowledge for decades, unable to speak up while Thomas Harrington lived, but ensuring the truth would eventually come to light. So that's why the locket was in Elizabeth's grave, Betsy said softly. It was Dr. Wilson's way of leaving a clue. And he's the one who buried Marie beneath Elizabeth, Judge Patterson added. A final act of kindness for both women. Daniel nodded, thinking of the inscription on the back of the photograph, friends in life, and perhaps beyond. Dr. Wilson had made sure that became true. As they left the lawyer's office, Daniel felt a sense of completion. The mystery that had begun with a simple volunteer project at the cemetery had led to the uncovering of a century-old injustice. Elizabeth and Marie had been silenced in life, but in death their story would finally be told. But there was one thing left to do, one final act of justice that had waited 100 years. The town of Pine Creek had never seen anything quite like the memorial service held that Sunday afternoon. The small chapel at the cemetery was filled beyond capacity, with people spilling out onto the grounds. Everyone from local officials to curious teenagers had come to witness the culmination of what the newspaper had dubbed the Harrington Mystery. Daniel sat in the front row beside Betsy, feeling oddly out of place as the reluctant center of attention. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. News of the discoveries had spread far beyond their small town. Reporters from state newspapers had come calling. A true crime podcast had dedicated an episode to the story. Even a television documentary crew had expressed interest. But today wasn't about media attention or sensationalism. Today was about setting things right after a century of injustice. At the front of the chapel, two photographs stood side by side on easels, Elizabeth Harrington and Marie Fontaine both smiling out at the gathered crowd. Between them rested two simple urns. After extensive forensic examination, both women's remains had been cremated as agreed upon by the Historical Society and representatives from Marie's family in Canada. A great-nephew of Marie's, now in his 70s, had traveled all the way from Montreal for the occasion, bringing with him family photographs and letters that added even more dimensions to the story. The service began with Judge Patterson offering a solemn welcome, acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought them all together. "We are here today to right a historical wrong," he said, his voice steady and dignified, "to honor two women whose lives were cut short by cruelty, and whose stories were buried along with them." Until now. One by one, people rose to speak. Historians who placed the events in context, the forensic anthropologist who explained her findings in simple, respectful terms, and Marie's great-nephew who shared family stories about the vivacious young woman who had left Montreal, seeking adventure and opportunity in America. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he approached the podium with shaking hands. He hadn't prepared anything formal, deciding instead to speak from the heart. "I never expected to be standing here when I volunteered to clean up an old grave," he began, drawing a few gentle laughs from the crowd. "I was just looking for a way to spend a Saturday, maybe learn a bit about local history. Instead, I found myself caught up in a mystery that spanned nearly a century." He looked out at the faces watching him, some familiar now, others strangers drawn by the story. "But this isn't really about me. It's about Elizabeth and Marie. Two women who formed a friendship strong enough to threaten a powerful man. Two women who tried to save each other and paid the ultimate price for their courage." Daniel glanced at the photographs. "I never knew them, but over these past weeks I've come to care about them, to admire their bravery. Elizabeth, already weakened by poison, witnessed her friend's murder and still tried to seek justice. Marie discovered the truth and refused to stay silent, even knowing how dangerous Thomas Harrington could be." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "They may have died in 1924 and 1925, but their story still matters. It matters because the truth always matters. It matters because powerful people shouldn't be able to bury their crimes along with their victims. And it matters because Elizabeth and Marie deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as the brave, loyal friends they were." After the service, a smaller procession moved to a newly prepared plot in a quiet corner of the cemetery. The Historical Society had commissioned a single headstone for both women, with their names, dates, and a simple inscription, "Friends in life, united in death," their truth finally told. As the urns were placed in the ground, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From a tarnished locket embedded in a headstone, to the full uncovering of a century-old murder case. It seemed almost unbelievable. The gathering slowly dispersed as the afternoon waned, people returning to their regular lives, though forever changed by what they had witnessed. Daniel lingered, not quite ready to leave. Robert and Judy Henderson approached, dressed in their Sunday best. They had become good friends over the past weeks, opening their home to researchers and sharing in the excitement of each new discovery. "It was a beautiful service," Judy said, touching Daniel's arm gently. Robert nodded in agreement. They would have approved, I think. I hope so, Daniel replied. It still doesn't seem real sometimes. Oh, before I forget, Robert said, reaching into his pocket. We wanted you to have this. It seems right somehow. He handed Daniel a small box. Inside was the key, the very same key that had opened the desk compartment and led them to Marie's diary. Are you sure? Daniel asked, surprised by the gesture. Absolutely, Judy insisted. You're the one who found it after all. And who knows? Maybe you'll find more mysteries to solve. Daniel smiled as he pocketed the key. One was enough, I think. As the Hendersons walked away, Betsy joined Daniel by the fresh grave. The Historical Society met yesterday, she said without preamble. We've decided what to do about the Harrington plot. This had been a point of contention. Some wanted Thomas Harrington's remains moved away from Elizabeth's original gravesite, viewing it as a final act of justice. Others argued for leaving history as it was, simply adding information about the true story. And? Daniel prompted. We're keeping the original plot intact, but adding a new informational marker that tells the whole story. The original headstones will remain, but visitors will know what really happened. She paused. We're also renaming the community center. It won't be Harrington Hall anymore. What will it be called? Betsy smiled. Fontaine Montgomery House. Daniel nodded, appreciating the gesture. Elizabeth's maiden name and Marie's surname, joined together as the women themselves had been in friendship. There's something else, Betsy continued. The board wants to establish a scholarship in their names for young women studying journalism or law, careers that seek truth and justice. They would have liked that, Daniel said softly. After Betsy left, Daniel found himself alone at the gravesite. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, not unlike the day he had first cleaned Elizabeth's headstone and found the locket. He thought about the chain of events that had led him here. If he hadn't volunteered that day, if he hadn't been assigned to the Harrington plot, if he hadn't noticed the small object embedded in the stone, Elizabeth and Marie's story might have remained buried forever, or perhaps not. Perhaps the truth had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge, patient through the decades as the town grew and changed around it. As Daniel finally turned to leave, he felt a strange sense of peace. The mystery was solved. Justice, in the limited way possible after so much time, had been served. Elizabeth and Marie had been given back their voices, their stories now a permanent part of Pine Creek's history. Back at his apartment that evening, Daniel placed the key on his bookshelf beside the photographs and documents he had collected during his investigation. The town would move on, as towns always do. The excitement would fade, replaced by newer stories and concerns. But he would remember. His phone chimed with a message from his boss at the accounting firm. After taking several weeks of unexpected leave to focus on the investigation, Daniel was expected back at work tomorrow. Normal life was resuming. Yet as he prepared for bed, Daniel knew things wouldn't be quite the same. The experience had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He had uncovered a hidden truth, given voice to the voiceless, and in the process, found something in himself he hadn't known was there. His grandfather had always told him that history wasn't just names and dates in textbooks. It was real people with real lives, hopes, and tragedies. Daniel understood that now in a way he never had before. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought he caught the faint scent of roses, Elizabeth's favorite flower, according to Marie's diary. A coincidence, surely, or perhaps a reminder that the past is never as distant as we might believe. The next morning, Daniel returned to his ordinary life, carrying with him the extraordinary story of two women whose friendship had transcended even death. And in Pine Creek Cemetery, a new headstone gleamed in the sunlight, bearing witness to a truth that had waited 100 years to be told. When visitors paused to read the inscription, they would learn about Elizabeth and Marie, about courage and loyalty, about justice long delayed but finally delivered, and they would understand that some bonds cannot be broken, even by time, even by death, even by those who would bury the truth alongside their victims. Some stories refuse to stay buried. They work their way to the surface like the locket emerging from Elizabeth's headstone, waiting for someone to notice, to question, to care enough to uncover what lies beneath. Daniel had been that someone, and because of him, two women who had been silenced a century ago could finally rest in peace, their truth known at last.